Thanks for coming today. Today we're going to be exploring the topic of paving the way for the automobile. And the reason we want to begin at the very beginning is because we want to take a look at the forces that were in place, technological forces and social forces that created the automobile, because they were the environment that the automobile is creating now. And you'll see what I mean by the end of our presentation. And the goal here, our goal fundamentally, is to help get us a better vision of what's happening in the world around us. And so we turn to the past for that. So today's session is here on paving the way for the automobile. Now, before we go there, I want to recap some content from last time, because it's fundamental to establishing how we do what we do. And the purpose of these series is to connect the dots between our past and our present. And we look to the past not because we believe that history repeats itself, but because we understand that the human spirit emerges again and again through different trials and different tribulations, through different achievements. While the specific particulars of history change dramatically from time to time, the human experience of those realities does not change. You know, we have a lot in common right now as humans with the epidemic that we're facing, the pandemic that many people shared when they went through a pandemic in 1918. And so we can inform ourselves about our present by looking at the past. And I also want to point out that this is not simply about getting a stack of facts. It's not. It's about the meaning. It's about the interpretation. It's about understanding the experience. And two of the key ideas that historians use as they process material is an idea of agency and multi-causality. And these are things we're going to be looking a close look at today. And agency is a simple concept that says that when history happens, it's because people make decisions, people make choices. There has to be somebody who's moving, some sort of cause, something that creates things. And there are people who are pushing for change, and there are people who are dragging their feet, and they're pushing for change in different directions. That's agency. And because there's so many people pushing in different directions and so many technological changes, that this is multi-causality. And the last thing we talked about last time was that fundamentally the scope of our inquiry is immense. I mentioned a tidbit that there are 1,700 texts and manuscripts in the Library of Congress about ancient Rome, and there's 1,900 manuscripts on medieval history, but there's over 30,000 on the automobile, because it impacts international trade and petroleum and dating and financial structure of insurance and all kinds of myriad parts of our society. And so this series fundamentally is to help us get a grip, to get a hold of the way the automobile impacts our society. Now, to start today, I want to introduce another new set of concepts that we're going to be looking at. In around 1958, there was an organization called the Society for the History of Technology. And it was about in this period that people were systematically asking about the future of our societies and how things were changing at an increasing pace. And so groups of academics from all kinds of disciplines came together. And one of the central definitions that they emerged with was a beginning of exactly what do we mean by technology. And you and I, when we think of technology, I think the most people kind of think of their cell phone as one of the first things they think of, but technology is actually, you know, one of the deepest human experiences. I think everybody's heard that, you know, humans have opposable thumbs. They build tools, the tool builders, and a tool is a technology in its simplest sense. And so you have this thing in front of you, the physical object is the thing you think of, but it's actually part of a system of tools that have to work together and practices. But embedded in that also is a process of construction that you'd have to have in order to make it, and then the things that people know about it and the social consequences. And I just want to give you a really quick illustration of that. Is this right here is something my granddad found on his farm in Minnesota around 1900. And it's a stone axe head. And this is, for the people who created this, which is something over 1,000 years ago, this was the premier technology of their society. This was the cell phone of their age, in the sense that that it was complex and difficult. And for you and I, it's, well, how complex can an axe head be? But, you know, I think if someone said, well, why don't you run down to the park and whip me up a stone axe, that I couldn't. you know, if you think about the knowledge necessary to make this, well, actually, first the system. You know, this is not something that works on its own. It has to have the right kind of wood for the handle, and it has to have leather that wraps it in a certain way, and the leather has to be cured and processed. And so you have this object and the system it works in, all these complex things that are part of it, and then you have the knowledge of how to do this. I don't know how to cure leather. I mean, I could Google it and find out. I don't know how to strap it on here, and I don't know how to hammer this stone into shape. I get a bunch of other stones and I'd start whacking on it, and I don't know, eventually I'd figure out which one was hardest and go from there. But that knowledge was passed down for generation to generation, just as this stone axe head was. You know, there's a strong possibility that this was someone's prized possession that was passed on generation after generation after generation after generation. This might have been in use easily for 500 or 400 years or something like that. And then every piece of technology has a social structure and a social consequence. The structure of the axe head in Native American society was a gender structure. You know, this is something passed on from father to son. Typically, males owned it, and it could be lent. And it also represented a trade structure, because there is no black basalt like this within 300 or 400 miles of where this was picked up. This is something that was traded over long distance. And we've got, all of a sudden, we've got a really interesting set of complexities about what on the very face of it appears to be the most simplest thing you can imagine of technology. And so we're going to start kind of unraveling and taking apart the car and the automobile as we examine this closer. And so let me give you an outline of how we're going to start examining this today. We're going to be looking at a whole bunch of forces that were in place before the car. You can see that there were roadways before the car. Roadways go back to the Mycenaeans and as far back as humanity, but they were in dramatic change. There were established firms and manufacturers and companies that were all in place. There were manufacturing processes, entrepreneurs, and these were all going through change, and they were all leading to something. Nobody knew what it was. Certainly nobody envisioned the car as you and I know it, but these are just sample forces at work. And this is not a comprehensive list, but you can see that this is a very broad system, that each one of these, in fact, would have to be in place for the automobile to emerge. So given that, let's just start with the topic of roads. And we'll just start, to make the story short. We won't go back to the Mycenaeans or Egyptian roads or Roman roads, although that's an amazing history and I encourage you to do it. But we're going to just start in colonial America. And so it was pretty surprising for colonials that when they arrived, that they found networks of communication in the wilderness. There were very well established Indian trails and Indian paths, because there was a very developed trade system among the Native American peoples. And so these fundamental trade paths immediately were capitalized on people who lived there. The fundamental means of moving large goods was on the waterways, but communities began to spring up along the waterways, and not everybody had a boat and a barge, and they're cumbersome, and so the trails around them became very important. As the population expanded in the United States, the roads formed around towns as soon as they sprung up. So you might have a waterway to a town and then some roads growing out from it. The roads did not connect the towns frequently. Sometimes they went from fort to fort for military roads, but by and large, roads simply sprung up from towns. And then the American experience with that mushroomed dramatically. As I was doing research for this presentation, I was pretty surprised to find out that around 1790 to 1830, there were about 12,000 miles of toll roads that developed in the United States. These had graded hills and hard surfaces, toll gates. About every 3 to 10 miles, they would have inns and restaurants and amenities. Now, most of these were financial failures. There was a lot of entrepreneurs who went to work to get these going. They saw a vision, they acted on it. A lot of them failed, but even after they failed, they left graded surfaces and they left an idea behind them. This eventually would lead into a system of stagecoach trails that cross the United States, which would then be eclipsed by railroads. And then you have the same processes. Roads would spring up around towns, leading from the railheads, but once again, not connecting from town to town. Now, an important change happens in the system in the late 1800s, and that's when governments get involved. The first Highway Act in the United States was a California legislature in 1895, creates a Bureau of Highways. And so this is something that had been happening in England. Government had become involved in the road system in England, and there was some patterning going on, but that's when it changes. And it changes because of all kinds of pressures from inside of the society. The bicycle lobby was really huge. It's hard to imagine, but the League of American Wheelmen was very important in the United States. There were truck and manufacturers who were trying to found an industry, and they knew that if they're going to have an industry with this manufacturing, you have to have roads to put them on. And so there were private organizations who were building trails and roads. And so this is the first piece. This is one of the pieces that goes in place that would create the automobile and make it a possibility. Last time, for example, last time when we talked about Bertha Benz and the road trips and how those created the car, we have to keep in mind that this is one piece of a broader picture. There's a lot of other things at work here. I want to point out also, I briefly mentioned, I briefly mentioned the role of the bicyclist. This is the one of the earliest maps in the United States of a highway map. And it wasn't an automobile highway, so to speak. This is in 1896, and it was a bicycle route. It was a bicycle highway. And if you want to see the scale of the bicycle's impact, one thing to look at is this number. We have roughly 2 million bicycles being produced per year in the United States, and the American population in the period was around 63 million. And so it had a dramatic impact. But now let's turn our direction towards another technology. Let's look at the development of steam. We can look at the steam omnibus services in England. And Richard Trevithick is often given credit for being the first of these road carriage services. And the photo you see to the left is a modern recreation of these road carriages. But you can see that it takes existing carriage technology up above, suspended, and then adds a steam-powered frame below it. This would develop very quickly and very rapidly as this technology took hold, because it offered all kinds of new opportunities for intra-urban transport. In 1927, on the right, you can see Sir Goldsworthy Gurney's steam passenger carriage, and this just kicked off a craze. And so there's all kinds of road locomotives flying across the countryside in England. And you can see here up in the upper left hand, you can see the large smokestacks pouring out the back. And there were all kinds of interesting laws that would emerge from this, all kinds of different social reactions. And among these social reactions includes the famous Red Flag Acts. And I want to point to these. Red Flag Acts because there's something that they typically are misunderstood, and they often appear in automotive history in a wrong context. The Red Flag Acts were not a rejection of the automobile. Very commonly in literature, they're cited as an anti-automobile movement. But I want to point out that these Red Flag Acts are 1861. Bertha Benz wasn't until 1888. So the car didn't exist. These were anti-steam laws. And the essence of the law, one of the elements was that someone with a red flag would have to lead in front of it 50 yards ahead of it and announce it's coming, because these things were steaming across the countryside, sometimes hitting speeds like 10 or 15 miles an hour, which was crazy fast. And so they put speed limits in the countryside and they put speed limits in the town. They created all kinds of restrictions for these. And there's also citations in the literature about red flag acts in the United States. And there was one red flag act in the United States, and it was 1894. And I want to point out that the very first, what's credited to be the first manufacturer of automobiles in the United States was Duryea in 1893. And so there was only literally a handful of cars in the United States in 1894. There were other cars besides Duryea where individual entrepreneurs or businessmen or hobbyists had built a car just to run it. But we're still only talking like 7 years after Carl Benz's first invention, and we're only talking about 5 years after Bertha Benz's ride. So cars are not a phenomenon, they're not a social problem. So these laws were actually a response to something else. So that was the only law in the United States. It only ran for 2 years and then it was repealed. But there were other technologies of transportation that would begin to have a huge impact on the automobile, and one of them was the electrics. here there was new technologies coming into place in around 1859, when there's a new storage battery in place, and around 1880, where there's an improved battery that all of a sudden it makes batteries strong enough to power an automobile. And this is such an interesting lesson about technology, because that was the promising technology of the period. That's what people were looking at as the future. You know, these smelly, rickety contractions people weren't so sure about, but these things were just wonderfully easy. And remember, the thing that really made the transition for the automobile is that it was reliable and easy to use. So much easier than having a steam-powered car, so much easier than using horses. And this had that in spades. These early electrics were quiet. It was odorless. You didn't have to crank anything. You got there and you hit the button. But at the same time, they had tremendous advantages. There was a short range and no charging facilities and batteries life. And it's interesting that you hear kind of same criticisms of people who are unsure of the future of Tesla. And these are exactly the kind of challenges that Tesla's charging right now: changing charging facilities, modifying battery life, dealing with the range issues. They've dealt with the weight issues, so they're better hill climbers. And so this was one of those technologies where it looked like in that period the smart money was on that technology, but in the end, gasoline motors would conquer that. The next technology I'd like to introduce to you is something, it's kind of fun. It's called the Lauf machine. His name was Baron Karl von Drais, and he was German. He was from Karlsruhe. And this took on a number of names. The French called it the Draisienne, and in England they called it the dandy horse. But essentially it was an exercise machine as he conceived of it. And you can see a modern reconstruction on the left where you have a pad to sit on and a place to brace your elbows, and there's a period drawing from the right. But this would kick off a whole bunch of inventions that would create the bicycle. And so in 1860, somebody gets the idea of putting pedals on their bicycle, and then you get better gearing by putting a big wheel in front with a small wheel. This increases the size of the rim, the circumference, which actually increases the gear. Now you can go tremendously faster. And then the safety bicycle in 1885. And so this would create a massive transformation of human society. This may be the most significant transportation device in history, second to the automobile, because it fundamentally changed the way everybody communicated and transported with each other. But one of the ways it's really fundamental for the understanding of the automobile is it created all kinds of technologies. In a lot of ways, the automobile would become the welding of carriages, conventional carriages, with mating them with bicycles, mating them with gas motors. And so the engineering elements that were developed by the bicycle, which was sophisticated steel tubing, ball bearings, chain drives, and pneumatic tires, those all went straight from the bicycle. And in fact, there were a large series of bicycles that were technically tricycles that had differential gearing, which is the one that Carl Benz actually patterned his differential gears off of. And then in manufacturing techniques, you've got quality production with specialized machine tools. And if there's anything that absolutely typifies the modern industrial life, it's that instead of having a sophisticated machine, rather than having a simple machine with a sophisticated operator, we transitioned to a sophisticated machine with a simple operator. We don't build cars with milling machines and lathes. You don't have a master machinist pumping out all the parts. You don't have somebody who needs 20 years of experience to really master it. Instead, what you do is you build a really sophisticated machine, and then you train someone to hit the button. And so this is something that's developed in the bicycle industry, and this would create lead to true mass production. Volume sheet metal stamping, electric resistance welding, these all came out of it. And furthermore, there was a pool of talent. There was a pool of industrial talent. Here's some of the car manufacturers that originally started with the bikes and transitioned. Opel in Germany, Clement, Durac, Peugeot in France, Hummer, Hillman, Morris, Rover, Triumph in England. And in the United States, Pierce, Pope, Peerless, Rambler, Winton, and Willys, all bicycle companies. And associated that was individual talent. So you have Morris, you have Charles and Frank Duryea. I mentioned them earlier, as widely referenced as the first American car. William Knudsen eventually would become a president of General Motors. You have the Wright brothers, a slightly different technology, but you can see where this is going, and the Dodge brothers. And so we have all these antecedent technologies that emerge in the bicycle that really create a new possibility. And now to kind of broaden the concepts and discussion a little bit, I want to turn a direction that you probably haven't thought much about, and that's urban geography. The way we lived together in cities was under transition, and it was under transition because of another set of technologies of interurban transit. That there were horse-drawn streetcars all over the urban landscape. And we're going to say a little bit more about those horses in a minute because they turned to be very significant in the history of car. So by 1873, cable cars were very widespread across the United States. And for some of you not familiar with cable cars, this was possible because of the advent of the massive steam engines in the very beginning of the 1800s. Massive steam engines, 4 stories tall, 5 stories tall, that you could park a massive steam engine at one end of town, and you could run a cable from it and drag the cable all the way across the town in a little trough through the center of the street. And then you would get a small carriage with a clamp, and you'd lower the clamp and grab that cable, and that cable was in constant motion and you could use it. So the advent of these massive steam engines enabled the possibilities of cable cars, which became very popular. And then electric street cars evolved as the dynamo developed. And so by 1890, though, most American cities operated on cable cars. And it wasn't until 1900s that streetcars dominated. And these are really important because they changed the urban landscape in a way that really meant that there was going to be a new demand for the automobile. And let me point to that diagram on the right. And so if you take a look at this picture for just a moment, you can see the star in the center. That's the original downtown model before you impose any transport. And the shapes, the areas around that, walking and horsing, you see that dark center? So going by horse, going by foot, you can't go very far because you don't want to walk 2 hours to do everything you want to do. So the towns tend to be very small and very densely populated. And now if you look at the small lines here with little dots on them, that's what's happened to the geometry of cities when you began to add streetcars. So now you have spurs that create long spurs that have walking distance surrounding them. So all of a sudden, the size and scopes of cities across the United States became far more complex and far more interesting. And then it added this other space, this blue zone. This is a blue zone where people would have liked to have lived, but they couldn't because they couldn't get there on foot until the advent of the auto. And so the auto would fundamentally change a city. And then if you tag on the interstates and the freeways and the high-speed transit, now you have massive cities as a possibility. And so people were hungering to live in the cities for all the amenities and all the benefits of city life, but it was actually very difficult to live there because it was very difficult to get supplies. It was very difficult to work. It was very uncomfortable. And these elements of transportation would change that. However, one of these elements of transportation that changed this in a kind of a really, really rotten way was the horse. And so now if we look at the horse in this environment, I did a little research on horses in the last week. I'd taken a hard look at it about 6 years ago as I became interested in the topic. But in New York, it's estimated that there were around 150,000 horses in 1880. And there's some disagreement about how many horses. Some sources push it closer to 170,000, some at 150,000. And so the average horse, of course, weighs about 1,100 pounds. But I figured I wanted to do some calculations. So I figured let's go a little leaner. They're not going to be fattening up. These are workhorses. So let's go with a 1,000-pound horse. So the average 1,000-pound horse produces 31 pounds of feces per day and 2.4 gallons of urine. I think you can see where this is going. So if you look at a typical horse per year, you're looking at 11,000 pounds of feces and 867 gallons per year. And let's skip down to the lower right. New York per year, this is tons, 848,000 tons of horse feces, 131 million gallons of urine. New York was an environmental disaster. People were looking for a green solution, an environmentally viable solution for transports in the cities. And this is not just New York. This was cities everywhere. And if you take a few minutes afterwards, after this presentation, and go Google some images from the middle 1800s, the early days of photography of the streets of New York, you will see something that's just absolutely horrendous with the refuse, the smell, the disease, the flies, the living conditions, and then of course the carcasses, because carcasses were falling down and dying all over the time. And typically the owners did not clean them up. They walked away. They hauled off their carts by hand when they could, and they just left them there. And so there's a lot of stories about kids who would wait until they got all emaciated and get the bones and play with them. And it became a street service by 1880. The city had a horse carcass removal department. They removed 15,000 carcasses from the streets in 1880. And so this is and I wanted to go some far-flung areas. I wanted to go out to horse populations, and I wanted to go out towards these geography questions, because I want to widen the scope of how we think about the car. And so if we think about this, then we had all these different dynamics that were pushing towards something, and the car would something that emerged because of this dynamics. But now let's take it a step further from there, and let's connect the dots, and let's look at today in the world around you. Every one of these dynamics is still in place, but it's flowing the other direction. Changes in the car and the desire to improve the car are changing the manufacturing process that we live in. The car is changing which firms survive and fail. It's changing the roadways that we're driving. It's changing the designs of our cities. It's changing our mobility. It's now a different kind of environmental concern. Questions about smog, questions about climate change, carbon footnotes. Key technologies are fundamentally associated with the car. You know, Tesla and the battery are a big story of the car. And entrepreneurship. There are so many people, and so many people, Elon Musk, entrepreneurs that emerge because of the car. And so this story of antecedents to the car is actually one that we can really use to inform us about the world around us. And I want to point out that I'm really just kind of providing some examples here. The story goes on. And one of the examples that I was really interested in presenting, for example, would be the horse of the carriage, which is the story of the carriage, which is one that really does belong in here because it's another technology. And I was so excited when I heard that Andy Beckman had agreed to join us, because Andy Beckman from Studebaker has a very close-hand knowledge of one of the car companies that was fundamental to this transition, Studebaker, that begins as a carriage company and transitions into it. So here's our story. Our story is that technology is a very complex system, all technologies. Now, there's probably no major technology that has the complexity of the automobile. You can look at other technologies throughout history that had this kind of complexity. Naval ships in the beginning of the 16th and 17th century, these massive construction projects. After the automobile, you can look at aviation and you can look at information processing technology. But we're talking about a technology that has a unique place in human history for both its scope and its content. So at that point, Amanda, are you there, Amanda?
Yes, Ken, I'm here.
Good. And is Andy with us?
Sorry, you're sooner than I expected.
Oh, you didn't think I was going to finish on time, did you?
I was listening. Horse carcasses, I got it all.
Yeah, I know. Last time I got carried away, and I wanted to make sure Andy had a chance to jump in here. And I'm so excited you're here, Andy. Actually, Andy, do you want to tell me some of your thoughts about this and some of your reflections?
Well, a lot of the touch points in your presentation there made me think of points of Studebaker's history, as they were, you mentioned, started out as a horse-drawn vehicle manufacturer, actually. Two brothers in a blacksmith shop, opened at a downtown South Bend street corner in 1852, and they grew to become the world's largest builder of wagons and buggies. In fact, there were some years in the 1880s and 1890s that Studebaker was building more vehicles annually than they did in some of their automobile years. But it wasn't an accident. There were, as you mentioned, the agency concept and a lot of players in making this successful. They were very good at building wagons. They were even better at selling wagons. They built a quality product mainly through developing wheel technology.
Was that right?
Yeah. They actually had a patented process for both their wagons and their passenger vehicles. In the wagons, it was called the slope-shouldered spoke, and this was a Studebaker exclusive. And essentially what they did, instead of making a square corner where the spoke goes into the hub, they radiused the corner, the mating surfaces, which eliminated stress riser. It gave you more engagement surface, and it made a stronger wheel that was also cheaper to build. Now, mind you, some of Studebaker's competitors advertise that, well, we don't go in for this slope shoulder spoke nonsense. We use nothing but the finest quality woods in building our wheels. But at the end of the day, the sales figures really speak for themselves. That Studebaker was leading the way in wheel technology. And they even acquired a patent. They had the Sarvin patent wheel, which was a composite metal and wood wheel hub that it sandwiched all the spokes together between two cast collars, and it was a stronger, better way to build a wheel, and it obviously served them well. As they even published little brochures touting the Studebaker wheel as the strongest. And I've watched a lot of Bonanza Little House on the Prairie, and I never saw one horse-drawn vehicle in there that had a spare tire or a side mount hanging off the back. So,
right. Well, next time somebody tells me you can't reinvent the wheel, I have a better answer for them.
And as you mentioned as well, the transitioning, how the Studebakers got out of horse-drawn vehicles from horse-drawn vehicles to automobiles, but their first vehicles were actually electrics. Electric automobiles came to Studebaker in 1902. Gas-powered cars wouldn't come until 1904. And the points you made about the electric vehicle being much simpler to operate, well, J.M. Studebaker much preferred the electric vehicle. When your name is on the side of the building, people tend to listen to what you have to say.
Yeah.
The quote is, he said, gasoline-powered cars are dangerous, clumsy, noisy brutes that stink to high heaven and break down at the worst possible moment.
Yeah.
All I can think about is he must have had experience with British sports cars, but he certainly. And I know, Amanda, I've seen you driving the Sprite online there, but thought we had to slip that in there. But yeah, so he much preferred the electrics. Studebaker started in electrics, and they produced electric, gasoline-powered cars and horse-drawn vehicles from 1902 to 1911. You could walk into your Studebaker dealer and get any one of the three.
And so, I mean, but it was a very complex operation. I mean, we're talking about huge acreages of production and diversified holdings. And what was that like? Do you have any thoughts about the complexity of the operations of Studebaker?
Well, we're blessed to have a great photo collection that shows the inner workings of the Studebaker plant in the late 19th and early 20th century. And Studebaker was quick to adopt new manufacturing technologies. Another point you touched upon in there. They were using electric welding, had better lighting in their plants. They had modern fire suppression systems, which coincidentally came right after two major plant fires. So maybe a little bit of locking the barn after the horse is stolen, but they still got in on that right away. And even from the marketing side, Peter Studebaker is the brother you don't hear about, but he's the one who went out and set up sales agencies all over the country. And even worldwide, Studebaker was exporting wagons in the early 1880s. And if you look at their brochures from the late 19th century, every major city in the United States has a outlet for Studebakers, and a very prominent outlet too. And it says Dallas, Portland, Chicago, New York, St. Joe, Missouri before they moved it to Kansas City, Jacksonville, Florida. All the major cities you could count on having a Studebaker dealer to get you the latest of horse-drawn equipment to get you where you need to go.
Let me ask you one more set of questions. I've always been a massive fan of the Avanti. Even as a child, I thought it was one of the more interesting and more elegant designs in automobiles of the period. And I think you have a thing for those, right? I mean, you've got to be an Avanti fan. I know you
I love
wrote
the
a
Avanti.
book.
I love the Avanti. For my money, it is the most improbable automobile story ever created. You have a company on the ropes who has a new president who doesn't know anything about building cars. He knows a lot about successful companies, but the automobile business is pretty new. And he says, hey, we're going to design a new car. By the way, we don't have any time. It's, February of 1961. I want this to debut in 14 months in May of 1962, which is impossible. But Sherwood Egbert, who had come to Studebaker from McCullough Chainsaw, he didn't know it was impossible. And furthermore, he really didn't care. He wanted it done. They call Raymond Loewy, He assembles a team at a Palm Springs bungalow. 6 weeks later, they have drawings. The Studebaker engineers and in-house styling department takes this A-scale clay model, turns it into a full-size car, and boom, there's the Avanti out at the Indianapolis 500 after a debut in Los Angeles at the end of April 1962. And Studebaker's got a brand new sports car that absolutely looks like nothing else on the market.
Yeah.
It's a testament really to what I've always maintained too. The Studebaker got the most from the least when it came to investment into their product and development. If you look what they spent on the Avanti, I think maybe it was $20 million, depending how you want to account for like advertising expense and other things in there. But you had a car that not only outlived Studebaker, it was still in production in the 21st century in a revised format, and just absolutely crazy. I can only imagine bank lending officer thought when, after Studebaker closed, these two South Bend businessmen asked for a meeting, say, so we want to start getting into the car business, and we want to continue building the Avanti. You mean the car that didn't sell for Studebaker? Yeah. And you guys want to build? Yeah. And have you guys ever built automobiles before? No. Do you have any experience in the automobile industry? No. Okay, here's a check. Go for it. You know, that's
yeah.
It was more complex than that, but
yeah,
it's just such an improbable set of circumstances, and for a car that, you know, it captures my fancy. That's a good way to.
Well,
We actually have one of those in our shop right now.
Oh,
We had one donated to us, an Avanti. I'm not sure details. I've just texted to ask details on it, but it's a fantastic car.
Yeah, I love it. I wish I fit into them a little better. Unfortunately, if you're over 6'1", 6'2", they can be a little cramped in there, but I'm going to get over that and definitely have a Avanti in my garage sometime in the future.
I was going to say your narrative, it really illustrates one of these concepts of technology we were talking about, that it takes a system of transition of knowledge. And so the first thing you do is you find people to work with. That's where it starts. So you get Raymond Loewy, and he says, let's get a team together and let's talk about how this is going to work. And in this period of the formation of the automobiles, many people don't understand that the discourse was dominated by a vast number of journals that emerged, you know, horseless carriage age and automobile age and all kinds of. In the 1890s, there was a large number of publishers that appeared to start communicating, and these circles of people who knew each other and worked together was all about communication and education. So you have a knowledge base at Studebaker. It builds over time, and then it finds a way to use it.
And with the Avanti, they really went back to the playbook that had worked so well for them in previous years, and that was fresh original design by Raymond Loewy. You know, offer something that is not being offered in the market, and take a risk, take a gamble, and with some solid engineering behind it. I mean, the Avanti was brand new on top of this, but under the skin, it was, you know, kind of state of the art 1955 in many respects. But you put it all together, and you made a darn good car out of it.
Very cool.
So Ken, we have a few questions that have come in for you and Andy, if you're ready to take some of those.
I think so. I can put on my smart hat.
So one of them was, did Studebaker build carriages and cars at the same time, or was there a hard transition where they just cut off and quit making carriages?
Well, it's kind of the short answer is yes. They made automobiles and horse-drawn vehicles at the same time, but Studebaker got into the automobile business by basically marketing other companies' automobiles through the Studebaker dealers. For the first decade, you had their first cars were built by the General Company of Elyria, Ohio, and then Garford, and then later they acquired an interest in the Everett Miskett Flanders Company in Detroit. And those companies, you know, basically startups, if you will, may have had to find a product, but they had no way to market worldwide. Studebaker had the name recognition. They've been around for 50 some years. They had a global dealership network. So this worked out perfectly for them. And eventually by 1911, Studebaker was satisfied the automobile was the way to go. They purchased EMF in its entirety. It became the Studebaker Corporation, formerly the Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company. But they continued building horse-drawn equipment until 1920. In fact, we have the very last Studebaker buggy and the very last Studebaker farm wagon on display here at the museum.
Yeah, it was not a quick transition to the automobile. I mean, the horse was still king all the way through the teens.
And also World War I was still largely fought as a horse war. Studebaker was supplying military equipment even before the United States entered the war. So that really actually helped extend the life of the horse-drawn side of the business, was fulfilling military contracts.
Yeah, it's one of the, I think one of the biggest misnomers about the First World War. All our imagery and all the films that are made, you see the troops being carried around in trucks, but the typical troop rode around in a carriage, or they walked in a wagon. They didn't ride in a truck. And it's interesting, we've actually chosen that topic for down the road. We're going to be discussing the Great War and the automobile. And then next week, we're actually going to be discussing the structure of business organizations and corporations. And the Studebaker story is really one of those great stories of how an organization adapts to changing times. But they have to have all that infrastructure. They have to have the marketing system. They have to have the distributorships in order to make the complexity of the automobile work. And that's what gave them a phenomenal advantage over somebody who was trying to start up as a mom and pop.
One of our local Indiana University South Bend professors who studied the Studebaker company for many, many years, and business in general, but he said mass production is nothing without mass consumption. You can have the greatest product,
Yeah.
you can't sell it, you're nowhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Very cool.
Okay, so here's another question. What is the story behind the Avantipede? Did I say that correctly?
This is my best puzzled look. The what?
It says, what is the story behind the Avantipede? I don't know what that is, but that was the question. So
I assume it's something like a centipede or a millipede. It's something you find in the garden.
Or velocipede.
Maybe the person who asked the question will elaborate a little bit on it. We also have a question. Why did Studebaker name a car Dictator?
Well, why did the cowboy take off his clothes and jumped into the cactus? It seemed like a good idea at the time. You got to remember that this name came about in the late 20s when Studebaker had the Standard 6, Special 6, and Big 6 models, which are very descriptive but not terribly imaginative. So they introduced new names, which was the Dictator, Commander, and President. But you have to remember, Dictator as a head of state did not take on sinister meetings until a few years later, when Mr. Hitler and Mr. Mussolini kind of ruined that name for everybody. And so, again, very much a product of its time, not intended to be evocative of any fascism or anything like that. It was just another title, for a powerful title for the head of state. But
I would even add a little more to that. From classical literature, dictator was generally a positive term for a single leader who had the interests of their people in mind, and kingship was often used as the negative one. So times change, language changes.
Yeah, they dumped the dictator name in 1937, not a moment too soon.
Yeah.
So we have, how do we respond to those who want to replace cars in cities and dense suburbs with bikes and skateboards?
Go ahead.
It's a tricky thing. It's because there's been so many different ways it's been implemented. One of the difficulties is actually getting the right kind of lanes and right kind of safety for bicyclists. An example is one of the ways this was implemented in London about 10 years was by moving the bike lane to the center between the car lanes. And you can quickly imagine how that resulted in a lot of confusion and accidents and danger for the drivers. And so the real trick here is to deal with driver safety and bicycle safety. There's a lot of formulas around the world. And if you're interested in pursuing this, you can look at the examples of the Netherlands, for example, where they've integrated their urban planning departments. So they have a Department of Transportation. In the United States, we have a Federal Aviation Department, we have an automotive department, we have rail as an entirely different bureaucracies. And so there's really no collaboration between these. And in the Dutch model, they've organized these into one central organization, so they have really tight communication. And I think that the answer is that if you want to do it effectively, it's because you don't try to take each piece individually, and where you're going to have countervailing solutions that make difficulties for other modes of transport. Multimodal transport can be done very effectively, but it takes the right administrative tools.
Okay,
Does
we
that-
have another.
Does that provide kind of a response? Okay.
There was a partnership between Studebaker and Mercedes-Benz. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, in the late 1950, actually 1957, Studebaker was on the ropes, honestly, as they were many times during that time period. A new management, Curtis Wright, the aviation company, had Studebaker and had kind of a management agreement. But part of that was Studebaker acquired the rights to distribute Mercedes-Benz cars through North America. So you saw a number, I think it was about 500 or so Studebaker dealers were dualed as Mercedes-Benz franchises. And they kept that arrangement until 1960, I think it was 64 or 65, and then Mercedes-Benz North America was established.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen with you because somebody sent in the Q&A a picture of the Studebaker Avantipede. I'm going to see if I can share that with you now. Can you see that? Oh, not yet. Hang on.
Not yet. Oh, there we go. Oh, look at that.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, it looks like a drawing though, right?
It says the entire front end opens. No, it's a photo. The entire front end opens up somehow mid-engine or something. So that's something people can Google and learn more about.
Yeah,
I've never heard of it.
I've never seen that before. I got to say, I Ken's comment, I'd be curious if maybe Photoshop was involved, but boy, I'd love to see that in person if it does exist.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Okay, now I've been distracted by that. Let's see. I had another question somewhere here about.
I do want to follow up on that comment in another way. I mean, that's what we're talking about, the innovations. The people are adapting their own vision, they're following their own curiosity, and that's the intimacy of the automobile for many, many people. And so that Avantipede, clearly the styling cues are Avanti styling cues with the sloping front and the metallic shades, these different elements. But it is an individual, some individual stepping forward and making their own changes. That's not your factory.
No, that is not a product of the Studebaker Corporation. I can tell you that.
So, are 1950s Studebaker hardtops considered collectible classic cars in today's market?
Oh, heck yeah.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
Why?
Okay.
Why?
Well, I'm going to assume we're talking about the 53 to 64 Starliner hardtops and the Hawk models that are the hardtop variety. But actually, I'm doing we just opened a Hawk exhibit here as soon as we got back from all the COVID-19 stuff. The Hawk is kind of like Studebaker's calling card from the 50s, very much an icon of post-war Studebaker production. You've got the bullet nose models is kind of the earlier stuff, but the Hawks are the ones that seem to garner the most attention. And if you look at the production relative to the popularity, it's almost like if the Avanti were not Studebaker's like cult film entry into the automotive world, you can make a case for the Hawk being that as well. They only 56 to 64 made about 80,000 Hawks, but if you go to any Studebaker show, you see more Hawks than anything else. And it's a great, and from the practical side of it too, because Studebaker never had any money to change much, there's so much parts interchangeability from even the 53 to the 64 models that, you know, from a restoration perspective, you have a lot of advantages. Yeah, there's not a lot of them out there, but so much stuff interchanges or fits, or and parts availability is very easy for them. Unless you want front fenders, those are getting hard to find because Studebaker is also very adept at rusting.
Well, Andy, we know that a lot of businesses and organizations are struggling right now with closures. And so one person has asked, what can we see as a visitor to the Studebaker Museum? And so this would be a great opportunity for you to take a minute and let them know once everything is open again, how they could experience the Studebaker Museum and what they'd find.
Well, we encourage people, if you're thinking about coming, now's a great time. We have been open for the last couple of weeks here. All the museum galleries are open. As I mentioned, our Studebaker exhibit is up and going right now. We have, we're looking at every hawk we have in the collection, including a prototype produced by Brooks Stevens that was intended to be the replacement for the hawk, and it's called the Scepter. We have that on display. You can check out Studebaker, from the oldest Studebaker we have in the collection up until the very last Studebaker made. We do require people to wear masks visiting the museum, but other than that, we are open regular hours. Check us out at studebakermuseum.org, and we are also on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, and Twitter.
Okay. This person said, kudos to the people of South Bend for keeping the Studebaker legacy alive. How did that come about, and why haven't more manufacturers embraced their history?
Well, I would say from a South Bend standpoint, you have to understand South Bend is a town at Studebaker's peak that was maybe 150,000 people at the most. I mean, we're talking about the metro area compared to Detroit, which has, 10 times that many at least, and, multitudes beyond that. So I think the best way to put it is you hear many people, when I first got to the museum, I would talk to old employees occasionally, and they would say, oh yeah, I worked for Studebaker's with the Possessive, as if Mr. Studebaker was, still there down at the office every time they left at the end of the day. And so it was a very close-knit community here, very much of the social aspects of the community centered around work in the factories, either through union activities or through the social organizations of the company. And the Studebaker being here since 1852, I mean, there's so many things around town even today where, coming up on almost, 60 years after the last Studebaker was made. But there's our main office buildings in downtown. It's the JMS building for John M. Studebaker. Clement Studebaker founded the local hospital, Memorial Hospital. There's parks, there's Studebaker Street, Studebaker Golf Course, Erskine Hills for Studebaker President Albert Erskine. It's on the south side of town next to Erskine Golf Course. There's, it's not 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, it's 3 degrees of Studebaker in South Bend. You're always this close to something that the Studebaker brothers had a hand in. And our previous mayor, I think, said it best from our legacy. It's like, we built things here. We built cars here. We were part of a major industry, and that legacy is still part of our community today, and continues to pay dividends.
I have a question about this. So the other major institution of South Bend is Notre Dame, right? I mean,
yes.
Is there a story? Is there a Studebaker Notre Dame story if you have these two really major social forces inside of the same community? Or
well, a couple of them. Jacob Studebaker, the youngest of the 5 brothers, actually enrolled at Notre Dame, and I think it was 1865, 1866, and took some business courses before he came to work for his brother's company, and he later headed up the fine carriage division. There was a number of things. Albert Erskine, who was president of Studebaker from 1915 until 1933, he served as the lay trustee for Notre Dame. A Studebaker salesperson sales executive held a position of some prominence in the football department. Newt Rockney, for example. In addition to coaching in 1928, he started working for Studebaker Sales, basically as the celebrity motivational speaker, if you will. He would travel around to Studebaker businesses. He would represent Studebaker at industry functions. And Studebaker even introduced a separate division to build a new car, and they named it for Coach Rockney after his death in 1931. So if you ever stumble across a Rockney automobile and you guys want to take a restoration step at that, we would certainly encourage that.
Very cool. That's really interesting. Good. Excellent. Thank you.
So we've had a couple of questions about Studebaker and racing. I'm trying to get them all together. They've come in at different times. This one is, oh, I've lost it. Sorry about that. I have them coming in on my texts, and I have them coming in on. So can you tell us a little bit about the history of Studebaker, and was there a race team? How did they respond to that era?
Yeah, it was, Studebaker kind of embraced the performance aspect of their products, kind of fits and starts over the years. Probably the most significant effort they put together was when Indianapolis changed the formula in the, I think it was 29 or 30, I can't remember which was the first year of that, to the so-called junk formula that encouraged stock block participants. So Studebaker had their brand new President straight 8 engine, 337 cubic inches of straight 8 glory, and a number of people said this would make a great race engine. So Studebaker engineers actually entered a private car in the 1931 race, and in 1932, Studebaker entered a 5-car factory-backed team at the 500. And they did very well. They were not the fastest on the thing, but they were great trundlers, as I say. They just kept going round and round, very reliable. They finished a team best 3rd in 1932, and in 1933 they went back. They added more streamlined bodies that year, and 7 of the top 12 finishers were Studebaker powered. They have some privateers in there as well. Now, I wish I could go and tell you that Studebaker dominated the Brickyard for the rest of the 1930s, but Studebaker entered receivership in March of 1933. It was only because the 33 race was already bought and paid for that they still went, and then everything, the racing program was disbanded. And it wasn't until the late early 60s, and really when the Avanti came along, that Studebaker went back into the performance market. They took a team out to Bonneville on 3 occasions to try as many USAC records as they could to promote the Avanti's performance capabilities. And actually, we have one of those cars, the number 9 Avanti, that hit 170 miles an hour on Salt Flats in 1963. And I looked, the car actually has the actual tires and wheels from that run on it right now. I look at those and marvel how tire technology and by extension safety technology has come a long way since then.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a unique history, and there's other things dotted. There's actually a great website, and God, Bob Coolidge is going to kill me if I screw up his name. I think it's studebakerracing.org or .com, but he chronicles every Studebaker in competition, you know, going back to the teens and 20s up till, you know, the very end of Studebaker production.
So we have reached the 1 hour mark, excuse me, the 1 hour mark, and I'm wondering if either of you have some closing comments, then I'll close this out, and then if people want to stick around for overtime, we do have a few more questions that I think they would like to hear answered. So Ken, Andy, any closing thoughts?
Thank you both for having me. Ken, I learned a lot from today, and wish I could tune in for the rest of your class here as well.
Very good. Thank you. You were the perfect choice for today. Studebaker's story fits right in with this complex narrative, and we're hoping that each kind of time we take a stab at this, we're going to explore a different direction, a different dimension of our relationship with the automobile. I want to thank everyone for giving us a format to try and explore this with you. I'm learning a lot every week, and I love it. So thank you, and thank you, Amanda.
Yes, thank you both. If you know somebody who might be interested in studying at McPherson College, we hope that you will encourage them to visit our website, mcpherson.edu. If you haven't already registered for next week's topic, which will be July 9th, it's called Thar Be Giants and Them Thar Hills. And Ken will be exploring Henry Ford, Billy Durant, and the mega corporation with our special guest, Bob Casey, who's the retired curator of transportation at the Henry Ford Museum. And so you can visit mcpherson.edu/wheels of change if you have not already registered. So we wish you all happy motoring. And for those of you who can stick around, we'll continue with some of the questions. Thank you. All right, gentlemen.
After party?
After party. Yes, after party.
Okay. I heard someone open a bottle of beer.
Oh no. We are still recording, guys. Ken, this question was directed at you, but either of you can take it. Would you consider recreation or sport as a force given how car races have exposed the invention to big audiences and how sport was hungry for advancing technology?
Yeah. Well, if we think about that very first Duryea in 1893, the first car race in the United States was in 1895, and it was in Chicago, and it was 3 Benz motor wagons against the Duryea, and none of them finished. But I mean, the second somebody put a motor on there, they were ready to race. And so if you look at it from an industry question about developing business models, and if you look at the passion that people have, and once again, F1 is, it's my understanding that right now it's the single most followed sport on the planet. People usually think it's soccer, but it's F1 racing. And so just the exhilaration and the fascination with speed, it's like, I view racing as a huge engine. And the thing is, you get these arms on these diagrams. I mean, this goes 100 different ways. And no, actually, it goes exactly 7.2 billion ways, because there's 7.2 billion people who all perceive the automobile in a different way. But for a substantial number of them, racing is that engine. Andy, I'm sorry.
No, you've nailed it. I mean, just the first race was when the second automobile was invented.
Yeah,
joke. So
that's right.
Yeah, you said it far better than I just did. But yeah, that nailed it, as far as I'm concerned.
So we have a question about Studebakers, and were they sold as a luxury brand, or what level were they at the time when they were being manufactured, and what would they compare to today in the current age?
Well, if you look at Studebaker's history as in the automobile era, and even in the horse-drawn era, Studebaker was blanketed the market. You could get carriages fit for heads of state. We have a number of Studebaker presidential carriages in our collections, down to they had their own economy line called the World Buggy Corporation. Apparently they didn't want to sully the Studebaker name on something inexpensive as what they were offering at those prices. But you get into the automobile age, and Studebaker is very concentrated in the upper middle class price market going into the first couple decades. And then in the later 20s, Albert Erskine was a pretty savvy businessman. He saw what Mr. Sloan was doing at General Motors and what Walter Chrysler was trying to do at Chrysler, and broaden the market. So Studebaker in like 1924, 25, they had one of the narrowest price spreads in the market. A couple of years later, they had bought Pierce Arrow to serve as their luxury brand, had widened out the Studebaker brand, and had introduced the Erskine automobile to be their new, low-priced, relatively speaking, offering. A couple problems with that. October of 1929 happened. The Erskine was not a very good automobile, and then the Model A came out, less than a year later to offer basically a better automobile at, far cheaper prices. And Studebaker slowly began dwindling down into the lower echelon of the market to the more mass end of things. And really in the 50s and 60s, Studebaker was more towards the bottom end of the price structure in the market. You could count on Studebaker being down there with the Ramblers and the Ford Falcons. That's where the Lark, their bread and butter model, was priced during the late 50s, early 60s. Today, and like we talked about earlier too, the Avanti and the Hawk were kind of the more upper end to draw people into the showroom, but it was Lark's Champions and Commanders that were paying the bills at Studebaker. Today, you look at kind of what Ford is offering today under the Ford brand with the lower models, the lower end of the General Motors lineup, the Chevrolet. It's probably a good example right there. Toyota. That was what Studebaker was trying to do, successfully and unsuccessfully at times.
We have a question here. What led Studebaker to want to merge with Packard in the mid-50s? And what would be Studebaker's story? This is a secondary question. What would be Studebaker's story in connection with the bicycle as a precedent in their history? So maybe start with the merger.
Well, want is probably a strong word for that. That came out of desperation. Studebaker was having a tough time in the early 50s for a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which is some questionable management decisions, an outdated labor contract, and Henry Ford getting tired of coming in second place to Chevrolet and starting a sales war in 1954. And Studebaker had, it's like all the chickens came home to roost. If they hadn't merged with Packard, Studebaker probably would have gone out of business within a year or two. So Packard, now you'll get a lot of different views on this, but Packard had cash, but Packard was not healthy during this period. They were having some plant issues. They had a whole big deal with some quality control issues at that time as well. But it was Studebaker and Packard hitched their wagon to one another as the new Studebaker Packard Corporation. and it bought temporary salvation for the company, but one industry insider termed it as two drunks helping each other across the road, which it was probably a pretty apt description. We can't. I won't bore you with the gory details, but Packard was gone by after 1958. Studebaker until 1966, so it bought some time, but it was, like hunt is not exactly the right term there. It was a shotgun wedding at best there. For bicycles, Studebaker was actually approached a number of times about getting into the bicycle market, and we actually have the board minutes on there. One proposal came before their board, and I think it was Clement Studebaker said, "I wouldn't touch that proposition with a 10-foot pole," and his brother Peter said, "I second that motion." So Studebaker was leery of the bicycle market, and I know there was like the up and downs of the bicycle popularity in the early 1890s, and I think this may have come on the tail end of that. But Studebaker was really quite content in the horse-drawn vehicle market, and wasn't too crazy about really branching out into the two-wheeled variety.
Can I ask you a question? I have a question
Go ahead.
about, can I cut in, Amanda?
Sure.
I was at a history conference a few years ago, and there was a paper about Studebaker trucks that had been part of the Lend-Lease in the Second World War, and he referred to very large, like outside assembly lines built in Iran and in Vladivostok. And was that a lot of companies that built these systems for the government took a very small profit margin, whereas it might have been tremendously lucrative. So the Second World War didn't right the boat. It didn't completely change the finances for Studebaker, did it?
Well, Studebaker had, during the wartime, the government said you're guaranteed cost plus. So cost plus a percentage, that's what you're getting paid for this. So, relative to whatever you're building, you're guaranteed a profit. And yeah, the war certainly helped, inject a lot of capacity into Studebaker's facilities and things like that. But after the war, Studebaker, unlike everyone else in the industry, never took a strike to get their labor situation under control. So in the seller's market after World War II, it didn't matter because they were selling everything they could put out the door. But Studebaker had the highest wages in the industry on 4% of the market. There's volleys of, the union bankrupted Studebaker, and it's like, well, no one forced high wages on the union, and no one forced Studebaker to pay those high wages. So that's what negotiations are for. It's if they want to pay me more money per year to do the same amount of work, I'm probably not going to turn it down. And certainly the union wasn't going to either, because Studebaker take a harder line with the union to get their labor back in control. They certainly could have and probably should have, but that's one of the many tent poles under the Studebaker tent that did not hold up for too much longer after that.
Very cool. Great narrative.
Two more questions I'd like to ask before we close this out. One is, the first U.S. car race in Chicago in 1895. I've heard there was a Studebaker connection in that the Studebaker facilities in Chicago were used for inspection and scrutineering for the race. Can you confirm this?
I cannot, unfortunately. It would not surprise me if that was the case, because Studebaker had a major presence in Chicago. In fact, I mentioned Peter Studebaker earlier. He spent a lot of his times in Chicago. He kind of split time between South Bend and Chicago. He had a very nice home on Chicago, I believe, on North Michigan Avenue. In fact, one of the Studebaker, I think actually maybe both of the Studebaker buildings, there's one on Michigan Avenue by the Art Institute it's the Fine Arts Building today. It still says Studebaker Theater above the door. And then they had a facility over on Wabash, kind of Automobile Row there. And that may have been the Wabash, it may have been either one. I can't remember the timing on that, on the construction, but it may have been, I don't know for sure.
Well, I believe it was raced in October, and the starting and ending point was down where the Field Museum is, because they had the Columbia exhibition there in 92 and 93. Okay. So they were using that in the venue. So that's 2 or 3 miles from that Art Institute area exhibition space, and the one on Wabash wouldn't be much farther. So it's certainly within short driving range to have done that.
And I'm pretty sure the Wabash didn't come along till a couple years later. But
okay, super.
So
by the way, one more thing about this race. one of the reasons nobody finished is they all got pulled over by the cops. And they were arrested not for speeding, but for having cars on the street. The cops said, you can't have those things on public streets. It wasn't about the speed. It's just that cops were not familiar with cars, and they didn't think there was any right of anybody to drive that thing, those contraptions. So that ended up folding up the race. Yeah.
Oh, Ken, I have a question for you on the whole, you're talking about the speed laws with the steam vehicles. You know, it couldn't exceed X number of miles an hour.
Yeah.
How did they enforce that? How did they?
Oh, that's a great question. And how did they measure the speed without a radar gun? I don't know. I know that they had a general idea that a person's walking pace is 3. Okay. And I knew they had an idea, and I bet you they pegged it onto a horse's pace is probably how they did that. Let me get you the exact speed limits on that. It was Locomotive Act of 1861, 5 miles an hour in the city and 10 miles an hour in the country. And then there was some caveats to that, actually, because there was some allowance for local variations that I think it could be up to 12, or local ordinances could limit it to 6 in the countryside. But that was the essence of it. And there were actually a tremendous number of other eccentric rules associated with it. One of the provisions that was passed was that the vehicles would need to consume their own steam or the smoke because of all the black smoke rolling out of those. And that was never enforced. It was never achieved. So, yeah. Good question. I don't know how you measured the speed of a horse. Although I bet you they had a notion of what a trot was. Because, I mean, they would know all kinds of things of horses we would not know and comprehend, because that was the central technology of their age, which is interesting. Yeah. Also, those laws really interest me because it's so interesting when you have kickback. I mean, the causation is people dragging and people pulling, you know, and there was a law that was proposed in Pennsylvania in 1896, and it's cited very often in documentary films and in books, and they cite it as a law. It was never a law. It was vetoed by the governor. But this is one that said that if a horseless carriage, if a car approached a horse, they had to dismantle the car and hide it in the brush, and they had required to carry a tarpaulin that was painted the same color as the countryside to conceal it from the horse, and that if the horses bolted, there was a fine of like $5 per mile that the horse ran. And so there were all kinds of things. These are often cited by people as laws that existed, but they did not. And so I think it's just too often associated with the car. It's really a steam omnibus thing.
Well, thank you.
I've gone into the archives, by the way, in Vermont, and haven't been able to find a copy of the original law, so I'm kind of stuck on that. If you find one laying around, let me know.
I will.
All right, one final question. This person has said, in my experience of meeting Studebaker owners at car shows and other events, they seem to be heavily dedicated to their vehicles, more so than some other car brand owners. I think you'd have a battle for that. I think others would get defensive of that. But it says, so more so than Ford versus Chevy or others. Why do Studebaker owners seem to be so hardcore about their cars?
Oh, geez. You're talking to a guy who has 2 Studebakers in his collection. So, yeah, I say, you know, it's easy to be a Ford or Chevy owner. It takes, you know, you got to dig deep down to really, you know, really do the Studebaker thing. But it's it's part of the. I grew up with Studebakers. It's all I ever knew. Those were the old cars that Dad had. That's just the way it was. So we met other Studebaker owners, and I'm sure you could take, you know, from my experience with Studebaker, you could insert any brand and find any family situation like that or group situation, and it's going to be the same thing. Everyone thinks their collector car is best, and they're the most dedicated, hardcore, you know, shoulder to the wheel people. And you know, with that being said, I can't go to the year 1 catalog and buy my Studebaker parts, but there's plenty of other places we can. So yeah, everyone's got their hardcore group of enthusiasts, and that's what makes this hobby so great.
Well, Andy, thank you so much. Ken, thank you. I want to do a special shout out to our friend, I hope I'm saying this correctly, Abhinav from India. He and his whole family have tuned in again, and they're watching, and it's very late there. So that's just really special that they are excited enough about this to participate, as are the rest of you, and we thank you so much for that. Next week, join us. You can go to mcpherson.edu/wheels of change to sign up if you haven't already. And Ken, any final closing words?
No, thank you so much, everybody. I'm so glad that we can share this together. And thank you so much, Andy.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you both for asking me. This has been a blast, and yeah, like I said, I've learned a lot, and wish you the best with the next go round.
All right. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thanks.